Sarah Martinez had always believed in the power of small kindnesses. At 28, she worked as a junior administrative assistant at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C. Every morning, she took the same bus route, grabbed the same coffee from the corner deli, and settled into her modest cubicle on the fourth floor. Her job wasn't glamorous, but she found meaning in helping veterans navigate the complex paperwork that stood between them and the benefits they deserved. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., and she went through her usual routine. She chose a simple navy blue dress with small white polka dots, paired with her grandmother's vintage pearl necklace. The necklace wasn't expensive, but it held sentimental value beyond measure. Her grandmother, Elena, had worn it on her wedding day in 1952 when she married Sarah's grandfather after he returned from the Korean War. Elena had given Sarah the necklace on her 18th birthday with specific instructions. Wear this when you need to remember that love conquers all obstacles, Mija. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes. At the time, Sarah thought it was just grandmother's wisdom, sweet but simple. She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The bus ride to work was unusually crowded that morning. Sarah found herself squeezed between a businessman reading financial reports and a young mother trying to calm a crying baby. As the bus lurched through D.C. traffic, Sarah noticed an elderly man struggling to maintain his balance near the front. His weathered hands gripped the metal rail, and she could see the concentration on his face as he tried not to fall. Without thinking, Sarah stood and offered him her seat. "Thank you, dear," the man said with a gentle smile that reminded her of her late grandfather. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." Sarah spent the rest of the journey standing, but watching the relief on the man's face made the discomfort worthwhile. It was exactly the kind of moment her grandmother had taught her to cherish. When Sarah arrived at her office building, she was running slightly behind schedule. The elevator was packed with the usual morning crowd of government employees, contractors, and visitors. Everyone stood in that peculiar elevator silence, staring at the floor numbers as they climbed. Sarah found herself pressed against the back corner, her briefcase clutched tightly to her chest. The Department of Veterans Affairs occupied several floors of the building, and Sarah's department handled disability claims and appeals. It was challenging work that required attention to detail and endless patience. Many of the veterans they served had been fighting the system for years, struggling with physical injuries, psychological trauma, or both. Sarah had learned to see past the paperwork to the human beings whose lives hung in the balance. Her supervisor, Margaret Chun, was already at her desk when Sarah arrived. Margaret had worked for the VA for over 20 years and had developed a reputation for being tough but fair. She expected excellence from her team, but she also understood the emotional toll their work could take. Sarah respected Margaret immensely and had learned valuable lessons about bureaucracy and compassion from her. "Good morning, Sarah," Margaret called out as Sarah settled into her workspace. "We have a busy day ahead. There's a special review meeting this afternoon with some high-level officials from the Pentagon. They're looking into processing delays for combat veterans' claims. I need you to prepare the Martinez file and the Johnson case summary." Sarah nodded and immediately began organizing the requested documents. The Martinez file belonged to a veteran named Carlos Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite sharing the same last name. Carlos was a former Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and was struggling with PTSD and a severe back injury. His claim had been tied up in the system for 18 months, bouncing between different departments and reviewers. The Johnson case was equally heartbreaking. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson had lost his left leg in an IED explosion in Iraq and was fighting for proper prosthetic coverage and vocational rehabilitation services. Both cases represented the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that kept Sarah awake at night, wondering if they were doing enough to help the people who had sacrificed so much for their country. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself deep in the familiar rhythm of reviewing forms, cross-referencing medical records, and preparing summaries. She had developed a system for organizing complex cases that impressed her colleagues and supervisors. Her attention to detail and ability to synthesize complicated information into clear, actionable reports had earned her recognition within the department. Around 11 o'clock, Sarah received a call from the front desk. "Miss Martinez, there's a gentleman here to see you about the Thompson disability appeal. Should I send him up?" Sarah checked her calendar and confirmed the appointment. David Thompson was a Vietnam veteran whose claim had been denied twice, and Sarah had been working with him for several months to gather additional documentation. When David arrived at her cubicle, Sarah could see the stress etched in the lines around his eyes. He was in his 70s, with silver hair and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He carried a worn manila folder filled with medical records, discharge papers, and correspondence from various VA offices. "Miss Martinez, I don't know what else to do," David said, settling into the chair beside her desk. "They keep asking for more paperwork, more proof. I gave them everything I have. My wife says maybe it's time to give up, but I can't. This isn't just about the money. It's about recognition that what happened over there mattered." Sarah spent the next hour carefully reviewing David's file with him. She discovered that a crucial piece of medical documentation had been misfiled in a different veteran's records. It was the kind of administrative error that could take months to correct through normal channels. But Sarah knew people in the medical records department who might be able to expedite the process. "Mr. Thompson, I think I found the problem," Sarah explained, showing him where the documentation should have been attached to his original claim. "I'm going to make some calls and see if we can get this sorted out quickly. Don't give up yet. Sometimes the system makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve what you've earned." David's eyes brightened for the first time since he'd arrived. "You really think you can help?" Sarah nodded confidently. She had learned that sometimes the most important part of her job wasn't processing paperwork, but giving people hope that someone in the system actually cared about their welfare. After David left, Sarah made the promised phone calls and sent several emails to colleagues in different departments. She had built relationships throughout the VA system, understanding that personal connections often move things faster than official channels. Her reputation for thoroughness and integrity had earned her allies who were willing to go the extra mile when she asked for help. The afternoon review meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in Conference Room B on the 5th floor. Sarah had attended similar meetings before, but this one felt different. Margaret had mentioned that officials from the Pentagon would be present, which usually meant someone with significant authority was taking a close look at their operations. Sarah hoped it would lead to positive changes for the veterans they served. She spent her lunch break in the small break room, eating a sandwich while reviewing her notes one final time. The Martinez and Johnson files were organized perfectly, with clear summaries highlighting the key issues and recommended actions. Sarah had learned to present information in a way that emphasized both the human impact and the procedural improvements needed to prevent similar delays in the future. As she prepared for the meeting, Sarah thought about her grandmother's words about small gestures creating big changes. Every day, she tried to live by that philosophy, whether it was offering her bus seat to an elderly passenger or spending extra time with a veteran who felt lost in the system. She had no way of knowing that the afternoon's meeting would test that philosophy in ways she never could have imagined. At 1:45, Sarah gathered her materials and headed to the 5th floor. Conference Room B was larger than the usual meeting spaces, with windows overlooking the busy street below. Several people were already seated around the polished wooden table, reviewing documents and speaking in low voices. Sarah recognized some of her colleagues from other departments, but there were several faces she didn't know. Margaret waved her over to a seat near the middle of the table. "Sarah, I want you to present the Martinez case first. Then, we'll discuss the Johnson situation. Keep it concise, but comprehensive. These folks don't have a lot of time, but they want to understand what's happening at the ground level." As more people filed into the room, Sarah noticed the atmosphere growing more formal. She could tell from their posture and the way they carried themselves that some of these were military officers, even though they were dressed in civilian clothes. There was something about the way they moved and spoke that reminded her of her grandfather and the other veterans she had known growing up. At exactly 2 o'clock, Margaret called the meeting to order. She began with a brief overview of their department's mission and current caseload statistics. The numbers were sobering. Thousands of pending claims, average processing times that stretched far too long, and a backlog that seemed to grow no matter how hard they worked to clear it. "The purpose of today's meeting," Margaret explained, "is to identify specific bottlenecks in our system and develop targeted solutions. We've asked Sarah Martinez to present 2 cases that illustrate common problems we're seeing. Sarah has been with our department for 3 years and has developed expertise in complex disability claims." Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly as attention focused on her. She had presented cases before, but never to an audience that included Pentagon officials. She reminded herself that she knew these files inside and out, and that her purpose was to advocate for the veterans who couldn't speak for themselves in this room. "Thank you, Margaret," Sarah began, standing and moving to the front of the room where a projector displayed the key points of her presentation. I want to start with the case of Carlos Martinez, a former Marine who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Carlos's claim has been pending for 18 months, not because his case is complicated, but because of systemic issues in how we process and coordinate information between different departments. As Sarah spoke, she noticed one man in particular paying close attention to her presentation. He appeared to be in his 50s, with gray hair and an unmistakably military bearing. There was something about his intense focus that made her speak more carefully, choosing her words with extra precision. She sensed that this was someone who understood the real-world impact of bureaucratic delays on the lives of service members and veterans. Sarah continued through her presentation, explaining how Carlos's medical records had been requested multiple times from different military medical facilities, how conflicting diagnoses from VA doctors had created confusion about his eligibility, and how the appeals process had reset his case multiple times without actually addressing the core issues. She presented specific recommendations for streamlining communication between departments and establishing clearer guidelines for complex PTSD cases. The room was completely silent as Sarah spoke, except for the occasional sound of pens moving across paper as people took notes. She could feel the weight of their attention and realized that this might be one of those moments her grandmother had talked about. A simple gesture, sharing information honestly and directly, might actually create meaningful change for countless veterans struggling through the same system. When Sarah finished her presentation on the Martinez case, the same man who had been watching her intently raised his hand. "Miss Martinez, you mentioned that Carlos Martinez has been waiting 18 months for resolution. In your professional opinion, what should have been the timeline for a case like this if the system were working properly?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Sir, with proper coordination between departments and clear guidelines for evaluating combined physical and psychological disabilities, a case like Carlos's should be resolved within 90 days of the initial filing. The complexity isn't in the evaluation itself, but in the number of people who have to touch the file without having authority to make final decisions." The man nodded thoughtfully and made additional notes. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her answer had been particularly important to him, though she wasn't sure why. She moved on to present the Johnson case, which illustrated different, but equally frustrating systemic problems. As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself answering questions and providing details she hadn't anticipated needing. The officials asked about staffing levels, training procedures, technology limitations, and her suggestions for improvement. It was clear they were gathering information for more than just this single meeting, possibly for policy recommendations that could affect the entire VA system. When the formal presentations concluded, people began gathering their materials and engaging in smaller conversations around the room. Sarah was organizing her notes when the man who had asked the detailed questions approached her directly. "Miss Martinez, I wanted to thank you for your presentation today. It's clear you have a deep understanding of both the procedural and human elements of this work." His voice carried the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to making important decisions. "I'm curious about your background. Have you always worked in veterans services?" Sarah explained her educational background in social work and public administration, her family's military history, and her motivation for choosing this career path. As she spoke, she noticed him listening with the same intense attention he had shown during her presentation. There was something about his manner that made her feel like her words carried more weight than usual. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," he said when Sarah mentioned Elena's influence on her values and career choice. "The idea that small gestures can create significant change resonates with my own experience. Sometimes the most important decisions happen in moments when we're simply trying to do the right thing." Their conversation was interrupted when Margaret approached with other officials who wanted to discuss specific policy recommendations. Sarah excused herself and began gathering her materials, feeling both exhausted and energized by the intensity of the afternoon. She had no way of knowing that her simple gesture of honest, detailed presentation had captured the attention of someone who could actually implement the changes she had recommended. The next morning arrived with the first hints of autumn in the Washington air. Sarah felt a strange energy as she prepared for work, as if yesterday's meeting had shifted something fundamental in her routine. She chose a different outfit than usual, a burgundy blazer that her sister had given her for Christmas, paired with black slacks and the same pearl necklace that had become her daily constant. During her commute, Sarah found herself thinking about the intense man from yesterday's meeting. There had been something familiar about him, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. His questions had been more penetrating than typical bureaucratic inquiries, suggesting he understood military culture and veteran experiences from personal knowledge rather than administrative training. When Sarah arrived at the office, she discovered that yesterday's meeting had generated more immediate action than she had expected. Margaret was already at her desk, surrounded by printouts, and speaking rapidly into her phone. She gestured for Sarah to come over as soon as she hung up. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with the regional director," Margaret said, her voice containing a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. "Apparently, your presentation yesterday made quite an impression. They want you to prepare a comprehensive report on systemic improvements for veteran disability claims processing. This isn't a typical assignment. They're talking about potential policy changes at the national level." Sarah felt her heart skip. "National level? Are you sure they meant me specifically?" Margaret nodded emphatically. "The request came down through channels I've never seen activated before. Someone with serious authority is pushing this forward. They want your report on their desk by the end of the week." The magnitude of the opportunity was both thrilling and intimidating. Sarah had always dreamed of being able to influence policy in ways that would help thousands of veterans, but she had assumed such opportunities would come much later in her career. The fact that a single meeting had opened this door felt almost surreal. Margaret continued explaining the scope of the requested report. They want specific recommendations for streamlining the appeals process, improving interdepartmental communication, and reducing processing times for complex cases. You'll have access to national statistics and can interview veterans from different regions. This is the kind of assignment that could really make a difference. Sarah spent the morning diving into research with an intensity she had never experienced before. She pulled data from multiple VA regional offices, analyzed processing times across different types of claims, and began identifying patterns that suggested where systematic improvements could have the greatest impact. The work was complex, but every statistic represented real people whose lives could be improved by better policies. Around noon, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from David Thompson, the Vietnam veteran whose case she had been working on the previous day. "Miss Martinez, I don't know what you did, but I just got a call from the medical records department. They found my missing documentation and fast-tracked my appeal. They're saying I should have a decision within 2 weeks." The joy in David's voice was unmistakable. "Mr. Thompson, that's wonderful news. I told you not to give up." After ending the call, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that reminded her why she had chosen this work. Individual victories like David's made all the bureaucratic frustrations worthwhile. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself working with unprecedented focus. The national report was beginning to take shape, and she could see how her ground-level experience could translate into policy recommendations that might help thousands of veterans. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice someone approaching her cubicle until a shadow fell across her desk. "Miss Martinez?" Sarah looked up to see the same man from yesterday's meeting standing beside her workspace. Up close, she could see details she had missed in the conference room. His eyes held the kind of depth that came from significant life experience, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that suggested military service. He was wearing a simple black suit, but his posture and bearing were unmistakably those of a career military officer. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said with a slight smile. "I wanted to follow up on yesterday's discussion and see how you're progressing with the policy recommendations." Sarah invited him to sit in the chair beside her desk, the same one David Thompson had occupied the day before. "I'm making good progress, sir. I've been analyzing data from multiple regional offices and identifying common bottlenecks in the system." Sarah turned her computer screen so he could see the charts and graphs she had been creating. The patterns are actually quite clear once you look at the data systematically. As Sarah explained her preliminary findings, she noticed him listening with the same intense attention he had shown during the meeting. His questions demonstrated not only understanding of bureaucratic processes, but genuine concern for the veterans affected by delays and inefficiencies. There was something personal in his engagement with the topic that went beyond professional responsibility. "Miss Martinez, may I ask you something that might seem a bit forward?" He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Yesterday, when you were presenting the Martinez case, you mentioned your grandmother's influence on your values. You're wearing a necklace that looks like it might have sentimental significance. Could you tell me more about that?" Sarah touched her grandmother's pearls reflexively. It was an unusual question for a professional conversation, but something about his manner suggested the inquiry wasn't casual curiosity. "This was my grandmother Elena's wedding necklace. She gave it to me when I turned 18, and told me to wear it when I needed to remember that love conquers all obstacles. The man's expression changed subtly, and Sarah saw something like recognition flash across his features. "Elena Martinez?" he asked quietly. "Your grandmother was Elena Martinez?" Sarah nodded, suddenly, curious about why her grandmother's name would mean something to a Pentagon official she had never met. "Miss Martinez, this might sound incredible, but I think your grandmother saved my life." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt the world shift slightly around her. "I was a young soldier in Korea in 1952, wounded and alone in a field hospital. A nurse named Elena spent her own break time reading to me and other injured soldiers. She wore a pearl necklace and had the kindest eyes I've ever seen." Sarah's breath caught as the pieces began connecting. Her grandmother had worked as a volunteer nurse in Korea before marrying her grandfather. Elena had told stories about caring for wounded soldiers, but she had never mentioned specific people or incidents. The timing and details were too precise to be coincidence. "She used to say that small gestures could change everything," the man continued, his voice carrying decades of gratitude. "Elena would bring letters from home to soldiers who couldn't read, help them write messages to their families, and somehow make that sterile hospital feel more human. She probably doesn't even remember me, but her kindness got me through the worst period of my life." Sarah felt tears threatening to gather in her eyes. "My grandmother passed away 5 years ago, but she would have remembered you. She remembered everyone she helped. She used to say that taking care of people was the most important work anyone could do." The connection felt impossible and inevitable at the same time. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said with genuine sympathy. "Elena was an extraordinary woman. I've carried the memory of her kindness for over 70 years. When I heard someone named Martinez speaking about her grandmother's influence yesterday, I wondered if there might be a connection. When I saw you wearing those pearls, I knew it had to be Elena's granddaughter." The revelation transformed their professional interaction into something far more personal and significant. Sarah realized she was sitting across from someone whose life had been touched by her grandmother's compassion decades before she was born. It felt like a continuation of Elena's legacy in ways she never could have imagined. "Sir, may I ask your name?" Sarah realized she had been so focused on the meeting's content that she had never learned his identity. He smiled and extended his hand formally. "I apologize for not introducing myself properly. I'm General Robert Hayes, currently serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Veterans Affairs. But, more importantly, I'm someone whose life was changed by your grandmother's kindness in a Korean field hospital 70 years ago." The weight of the revelation settled over Sarah. She had been presenting to a senior Pentagon official whose life had been directly influenced by her grandmother's small gestures of compassion. The coincidence felt too meaningful to be random, as if Elena's spirit had somehow orchestrated this connection across decades and circumstances. General Hayes continued sharing his memories of Elena's care during his recovery in Korea. He described how she had noticed that he was left-handed and adjusted his meal tray accordingly, how she had helped him write letters to his parents when his injuries made it difficult, and how she had sung softly while changing his bandages to distract him from the pain. "Your grandmother had this way of making every person feel seen and valued," General Hayes explained. "She treated each soldier as someone's son, brother, or husband, not just as a case to be processed. That perspective shaped how I've tried to approach leadership throughout my military career." Sarah shared stories about Elena's life after Korea, how she had married Sarah's grandfather and raised 4 children while continuing to volunteer with veteran organizations. She never stopped believing in the power of small kindnesses. Even when she was in her 80s, she was organizing care packages for deployed soldiers and writing letters to veterans in nursing homes. As their conversation deepened, Sarah began to understand that yesterday's meeting had been more than a routine policy review. General Hayes had been specifically looking for people within the VA system who shared Elena's philosophy of treating each case as a human being rather than just paperwork. Her presentation had demonstrated exactly the kind of perspective he had been hoping to find. "Miss Martinez, I want to be transparent about something," General Hayes said, leaning forward slightly. "Yesterday's meeting wasn't just about identifying problems in the system. I've been tasked with finding people within the VA who could help implement comprehensive reforms. Your presentation demonstrated exactly the kind of understanding we need at the policy level." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "What kind of implementation are you talking about, sir?" General Hayes explained that the Department of Defense and VA were planning the most significant coordination improvements in decades, aimed at seamlessly transitioning service members from active duty to veteran status without the bureaucratic gaps that currently cause so many problems. We need people who understand both the human impact of these policies and the practical realities of implementation, he continued. Your presentation yesterday showed me that you have that rare combination of technical competence and genuine empathy. The fact that you're Elena's granddaughter makes this feel like more than coincidence. The opportunity General Hayes was describing would involve leaving her current position to join a special task force in Washington that would design and implement new policies nationwide. It was the kind of career advancement that typically took decades to achieve, offered to her because of a single honest presentation and an extraordinary family connection. I would need time to consider such a significant change, Sarah said carefully. This work is important to me, but so is my current commitment to the veterans I'm already serving. General Hayes nodded approvingly. That response tells me everything I need to know about your character. Elena would be proud of the woman you've become. As General Hayes prepared to leave, he pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and wrote something on the back. My direct number is on there. When you're ready to discuss this opportunity, please call me. There's no pressure and no timeline, but I believe you could help us create the kind of system your grandmother would have wanted for the soldiers she cared about. After he left, Sarah sat quietly at her desk, trying to process the afternoon's revelations. The pearl necklace felt heavier around her neck, as if it now carried the weight of her grandmother's legacy and the possibility of continuing that work on a scale she had never imagined. She thought about Elena's words about small gestures creating big changes and realized she was living exactly that philosophy. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of research and reflection. Sarah continued working on the policy report, but her perspective had shifted dramatically. What had started as an assignment was now feeling like a calling, a chance to honor her grandmother's memory by helping to create systems that would treat every veteran with the same compassion Elena had shown in that Korean field hospital. When Sarah finally left the office that evening, she carried General Hayes's business card in her purse and her grandmother's necklace around her neck. The simple gesture of passing a pen in a meeting, which had led to an honest presentation about systematic problems, had somehow connected her to a family legacy she was only beginning to understand. She had no idea that the most significant moment was still to come. Sarah spent the evening at her small Arlington apartment, surrounded by papers and her laptop, working on the comprehensive report that General Hayes had requested. But her concentration kept drifting to the extraordinary connection she had discovered. The idea that her grandmother's kindness from 70 years ago had somehow led to this career opportunity felt like something out of a novel rather than real life. She called her mother, Patricia, to share the incredible story. Patricia listened in amazement as Sarah described meeting General Hayes and learning about Elena's impact on his life in Korea. Mija, your grandmother always said that kindness has a way of coming back to you when you least expect it, Patricia said through tears. She would be so proud to know that her care for that young soldier led to this opportunity for you. Patricia shared additional stories about Elena's volunteer work that Sarah had never heard. After returning from Korea and marrying Sarah's grandfather, Elena had quietly continued helping veterans for decades. She had organized support groups for military wives, volunteered at VA hospitals, and maintained correspondence with dozens of former soldiers she had met over the years. Elena had never spoken about these activities as anything special, simply as what any decent person would do. Your grandmother kept a box of letters from soldiers she had helped, Patricia revealed. It's in my closet somewhere. Maybe it's time you saw what kind of impact she really had. Sarah promised to visit that weekend to go through Elena's correspondence, suddenly, eager to understand the full scope of her grandmother's legacy. The next morning brought new energy to Sarah's work on the policy report. She approached the research with renewed purpose, knowing that General Hayes would evaluate her recommendations not just as bureaucratic suggestions, but as potential solutions to problems that had personal significance for both of them. The report was becoming more than a professional document. It was a bridge between Elena's philosophy of individual compassion and systematic changes that could help thousands of veterans. Sarah's analysis revealed patterns that were both troubling and hopeful. The troubling part was how consistently good people within the system were frustrated by bureaucratic obstacles that prevented them from helping veterans effectively. The hopeful part was how relatively small changes in procedures, and communication protocols could eliminate most of these obstacles without requiring massive budget increases or staff restructuring. Her key recommendations centered on what she termed continuous advocacy, a system where each veteran would have a designated advocate who followed their case from initial filing through final resolution. This advocate would have authority to cut through departmental boundaries and expedite resolution of administrative delays. It was essentially Elena's approach of treating each person as an individual rather than a case number, scaled up to work within a large bureaucratic system. As Sarah refined her recommendations, she received a call from Carlos Martinez, the Marine whose case she had presented in the meeting with General Hayes. "Miss Martinez, I just wanted to thank you for whatever you did. I got a call this morning that my claim has been approved and my benefits will start next month. 18 months of waiting, and suddenly, everything is moving." Carlos's call was followed by similar messages from 3 other veterans whose cases had been inexplicably fast-tracked through the system. Sarah began to suspect that General Hayes was quietly testing whether her recommendations could work in practice by applying them to specific cases she had mentioned. If so, the early results were remarkably encouraging. Margaret confirmed Sarah's suspicions when she stopped by her cubicle that afternoon. "Sarah, I don't know what you said in that meeting, but someone with serious influence is making things happen. For cases you've worked on have been expedited through channels I didn't even know existed. Whatever they're planning, you've definitely gotten their attention." The realization that her recommendations were already being tested in real time added both excitement and pressure to Sarah's work. She knew that General Hayes would be watching to see whether her theories translated into practical improvements for actual veterans. The success of Carlos Martinez and the others suggested that her approach had merit, but she also understood that sustainable change would require more than individual interventions. That evening, Sarah worked late in the office, refining her report and ensuring that every recommendation was backed by solid data and clear implementation strategies. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice someone approaching until she heard a familiar voice. "You're here quite late, Miss Martinez." Sarah looked up to see General Hayes standing near her cubicle, dressed more casually than in their previous meetings. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to see how the report was progressing and share some feedback on the pilot cases we've been testing." Sarah gestured to the chair beside her desk, noting that General Hayes seemed more relaxed than during their formal meetings. "I've been incorporating additional data from regional offices. The patterns are even clearer than I initially thought. Small procedural changes could dramatically improve outcomes for veterans nationwide." General Hayes reviewed the sections Sarah had completed, asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. His questions demonstrated not only understanding of the recommendations, but practical experience with large-scale organizational change. Sarah realized she was receiving feedback from someone who had successfully implemented complex reforms in military organizations. "Your continuous advocacy model is particularly compelling," General Hayes said, looking up from the report. "It reminds me of something your grandmother used to say in that Korean hospital. She told us that healing happened when someone took responsibility for the whole person, not just their immediate medical needs. You found a way to apply that philosophy systematically." The connection between Elena's individual compassion and Sarah's policy recommendations felt increasingly profound. Sarah was beginning to understand that her grandmother's influence had shaped not only her values but her analytical approach to solving complex problems. The idea of treating each veteran as a whole person rather than a collection of symptoms or claims was fundamentally Elena's worldview adapted to modern bureaucratic realities. "General Hayes, may I ask you something?" Sarah said, setting down her pen. "When you came to that meeting earlier this week, were you specifically looking for someone like me, or was finding Elena's granddaughter really just coincidence?" General Hayes smiled and leaned back in his chair, considering how to answer. "Sarah, I've been in the military for over 40 years, and I've learned that there are very few true coincidences in life. I came to that meeting looking for people who understood that veteran services are fundamentally about human dignity, not just administrative efficiency. When I heard your presentation and saw your grandmother's necklace, I suspected there might be a deeper connection." He paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. Elena Martinez isn't a common name, and someone who speaks about their grandmother's influence on their values while wearing vintage pearls in a VA office is quite memorable. I had my staff research your background after the meeting. When I confirmed that Elena was your grandmother, I knew I had found exactly who we needed for this project. The revelation that General Hayes had specifically sought her out because of the Elena connection was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. Sarah realized that her career trajectory had fundamentally changed because she had chosen to wear her grandmother's necklace to a routine meeting and speak honestly about Elena's influence on her values. But, Sarah, General Hayes continued, even if you weren't Elena's granddaughter, your presentation would have impressed me. The connection to Elena made this feel like destiny, but your competence and perspective made you the right person for this opportunity. Don't underestimate your own qualifications. Their conversation was interrupted by the building's security guard, who was making evening rounds and reminded them that the building would be locked soon. General Hayes gathered his materials and prepared to leave, but he paused before standing up. Sarah, I want to share something with you that might help you understand the significance of this opportunity. The reforms we're planning aren't just about improving efficiency. We're trying to create a system that honors the service and sacrifice of every veteran in ways that our current bureaucracy simply cannot accomplish. He explained that Congress had allocated significant resources for veteran services reform, but previous attempts had failed because they focused on administrative restructuring without addressing the cultural and philosophical foundations of how veterans were treated. We need people who understand that this work is ultimately about respect and recognition, not just processing claims faster. General Hayes pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on Sarah's desk. This contains a formal offer for you to join our task force. The position comes with a significant salary increase and the opportunity to shape policy that will affect millions of veterans over the coming decades. But, more importantly, it's a chance to continue your grandmother's work on a scale she never could have imagined. Sarah accepted the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. General Hayes, I'm honored by this opportunity, but I need to understand something. If I take this position, will I still be able to help individual veterans like Carlos Martinez and David Thompson? I don't want to lose touch with the human impact of these policies. Sarah, that question tells me everything I need to know about why you're right for this job, General Hayes responded. The task force position will involve traveling to VA facilities nationwide, working directly with veterans and staff to understand how policies affect real people. You won't be sitting in a Washington office making abstract recommendations. You'll be Elena's granddaughter taking her philosophy of individual compassion and applying it systematically. As they walked toward the elevator together, General Hayes shared more details about the scope of the position. Sarah would be part of a small team responsible for designing, implementing, and evaluating new approaches to veteran services. The work would involve collaboration with military commanders, VA administrators, congressional staff, and, most importantly, veterans themselves. The timeline is aggressive, General Hayes warned. We have 18 months to demonstrate significant improvements in veteran outcomes, or Congress will redirect the funding to other priorities. But I believe we can create lasting change if we have the right people focused on the right solutions. In the elevator, Sarah found herself studying General Hayes more closely. She could see elements of the young soldier her grandmother had cared for in Korea, despite the decades and distinguished career that had transformed him. There was still something vulnerable in his eyes when he spoke about Elena's kindness, as if that experience had remained a touchstone throughout his life. General Hayes, may I ask what Elena meant to you beyond the medical care? You mentioned that her kindness shaped your approach to leadership. General Hayes was quiet for a moment as the elevator descended. Sarah, when I was wounded in Korea, I was 19 years old and terrified that I would never walk normally again. The physical therapy was painful, and I was angry at the world. Elena somehow saw past my attitude to the scared kid underneath. She treated me with dignity when I felt like damaged goods. He paused as they reached the lobby. More than 70 years later, every time I make a decision that affects other people's lives, I ask myself what Elena would do. How would she treat this person? What would honor their dignity? Your grandmother didn't just heal my leg. She taught me how to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Outside the building, as they prepared to go their separate ways, General Hayes made one final comment. Sarah, whatever you decide about this opportunity, never forget that your grandmother's greatest gift wasn't her medical skill. It was her ability to make every person feel valued and cared for. You have that same gift. Whether you use it in your current job or in the task force position, don't underestimate its power. As Sarah drove home that evening, she carried the unopened envelope on the passenger seat and wore her grandmother's pearls with a new understanding of their significance. Elena's simple gesture of compassion to a wounded soldier had somehow led to this moment, where that same soldier, now a general, was offering Elena's granddaughter the chance to honor that legacy through service to thousands of veterans. The weight of the opportunity was balanced by the certainty that Elena would have wanted her to follow her heart rather than her ambitions. Sarah realized she needed to visit her mother that weekend, not just to see Elena's letters, but to spend time in the house where her grandmother's values had been lived out daily for decades. The decision about General Hayes's offer would come from understanding not just the career implications, but the personal calling that had brought her to this moment. Saturday morning found Sarah driving through the familiar neighborhoods of her childhood in suburban Maryland, heading to her mother's house, with General Hayes's unopened envelope on the passenger seat. She had deliberately avoided reading the formal offer, wanting to make her decision based on more than salary figures and job titles. The conversation with her mother and the discovery of Elena's letters felt more important than any professional considerations. Patricia Martinez Thompson was waiting on the front porch when Sarah arrived, holding a dusty cardboard box that had clearly been stored in a closet for years. "I stayed up late last night going through your grandmother's things," Patricia said, embracing her daughter. "I had forgotten how much correspondence she kept. There are letters here from soldiers dating back to the 1950s. Inside the familiar house where Sarah had spent countless weekends as a child, they settled in the living room where Elena's presence still felt tangible. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, including several of Elena in her volunteer nurse uniform from Korea. Sarah had looked at those pictures hundreds of times without fully understanding their significance. "Before we look at the letters, tell me about this job offer," Patricia said, settling into Elena's old rocking chair. "I can see from your expression that it's not a simple decision." Sarah explained the scope of General Hayes's offer, the salary increase, and the potential impact on veteran services nationwide. But she also shared her concerns about leaving direct service to individual veterans. "Mija, do you remember what your grandmother used to say about rivers and streams?" Patricia asked. Sarah nodded, recalling Elena's metaphor about how small streams eventually became mighty rivers. She believed that individual acts of kindness were like tributaries feeding into something larger. Maybe this job opportunity is your chance to become part of the river instead of just one stream. They opened Elena's box of correspondence together, revealing hundreds of letters organized chronologically and tied with faded ribbon. The earliest letters dated from 1952, written in the careful handwriting of young soldiers learning to write with injured hands. Sarah recognized Elena's influence in many of the letters, which described not just physical recovery, but emotional healing and renewed hope for the future. One letter, dated March 1953, particularly caught Sarah's attention. It was from a soldier named Robert Hayes, written 3 months after his discharge from the Korean Field Hospital. Sarah's heart raced as she realized she was holding correspondence from the young man who had grown up to become General Hayes. "Dear Elena," the letter began, "I know you probably don't remember me among all the soldiers you helped, but I wanted you to know that I made it home safely, and my leg is healing better than the doctors expected. More importantly, I wanted to thank you for helping me remember who I was before I got wounded. The letters you helped me write to my parents, the books you read to us, and your kindness when I was angry at everything made me want to be a better person." Sarah continued reading with tears in her eyes. "I've decided to make the Army my career, and I want to be the kind of leader who treats soldiers the way you treated us. You showed me that taking care of people isn't just about doing your job. It's about seeing each person as someone's son or daughter who deserves respect and dignity, especially when they're hurt or scared." The letter concluded with a promise that moved Sarah deeply. "Elena, I promise that if I ever have the opportunity to help people the way you helped me, I'll remember your example. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the world because it reminds people of their worth when they've forgotten it themselves." Patricia wiped tears from her eyes as Sarah finished reading. "Your grandmother kept that letter for 70 years. She never mentioned it specifically, but now I understand why she always said that the work you do with veterans was part of something bigger than we realized." They spent the morning reading through dozens of letters from soldiers Elena had helped over the decades. Many described her impact in similar terms. She had seen their potential when they couldn't see it themselves, treated them with dignity when they felt broken, and somehow communicated hope when they had lost faith in their future. The pattern was remarkably consistent across different wars, different injuries, and different personalities. "Sarah, your grandmother never talked about these letters as proof of anything she had accomplished," Patricia explained. She kept them because she said they reminded her why the work mattered when it got difficult. She used to say that every person who crossed her path was carrying invisible wounds that kindness could heal. Around noon, they took a break from reading to prepare lunch in Elena's old kitchen. Sarah found herself standing at the same counter where her grandmother had taught her to make tamales for Christmas, remembering conversations about service and compassion that had shaped her values without her fully realizing it. "Mama, did grandmother ever talk about regretting any choices she made in her life?" Sarah asked as they worked together. Patricia considered the question carefully. Elena used to say that the only choices she regretted were the times she had opportunities to help someone and didn't take them. She believed that when God puts someone in your path who needs help, ignoring that calling diminishes both of you. The conversation helped Sarah understand that her decision about General Hayes's offer wasn't really about career advancement or salary considerations. It was about whether she believed she could honor Elena's legacy more effectively through individual service or systematic change. Both approaches reflected Elena's values, but the scale and impact would be dramatically different. After lunch, they continued exploring Elena's correspondence, discovering letters that revealed the breadth of her volunteer work throughout her life. She had helped establish support groups for military families, organized care packages for deployed soldiers, and maintained friendships with veterans and their families for decades. Her impact had been far more extensive than Sarah had ever realized. One folder contained letters from the families of soldiers Elena had helped, thanking her for providing comfort during their darkest moments. Sarah realized that Elena's simple gestures had rippled outward through generations, affecting not just the soldiers themselves, but their wives, children, and communities. It was a powerful example of how individual compassion could create systematic change over time. "Sarah, there's something else I need to show you," Patricia said, pulling a smaller box from Elena's bedroom closet. "Your grandmother left specific instructions about when you should receive this." Inside was a leather journal filled with Elena's handwriting, chronicling her thoughts about service, compassion, and the connections between seemingly unrelated events. One entry, dated just months before Elena's death, particularly resonated with Sarah's current situation. "I've been thinking about that young soldier Robert who promised to remember what he learned about kindness. I wonder what became of him and whether he kept his promise. I pray that the seeds we plant through simple acts of love continue growing long after we're gone." Elena had concluded that entry with advice that seemed written specifically for Sarah's current dilemma. When opportunities arise to expand the reach of compassion, we must be brave enough to accept them, even if they require leaving familiar ground. The work of healing the world is too important to be limited by our comfort zones. Reading her grandmother's words about Robert Hayes's promise and the importance of accepting opportunities to expand compassion's reach felt like receiving direct guidance from beyond. Sarah realized that Elena had somehow anticipated this moment and provided the wisdom Sarah needed to make her decision. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah and her mother continued exploring Elena's papers, discovering documentation of her involvement with veteran advocacy organizations, congressional testimony about veteran healthcare needs, and correspondence with politicians about military family support. Elena had quietly influenced policy through persistent advocacy and relationship building over decades. "Your grandmother never talked about this political work," Patricia said, reviewing Elena's testimony before a Senate committee in 1987. "She must have felt that bragging about advocacy wasn't appropriate. But look at this impact. She was instrumental in expanding mental health services for Vietnam veterans." The discovery that Elena had successfully influenced veteran policy through patient, persistent advocacy provided Sarah with a model for how individual compassion could create systematic change. Elena had never abandoned direct service to veterans, but she had also recognized when opportunities arose to help thousands of people through policy improvements. By evening, Sarah felt she had gained a comprehensive understanding of Elena's approach to service and the philosophical foundation for her own decision. Elena's example demonstrated that effective advocacy required both individual compassion and willingness to work for systematic improvements when those opportunities arose. As Sarah prepared to leave her mother's house, she finally opened General Hayes's envelope. The formal offer was even more comprehensive than she had expected, including opportunities for additional education, collaboration with national veterans organizations, and a clear pathway for career advancement within veteran advocacy. More importantly, the position description emphasized direct contact with veterans and families, ensuring she wouldn't lose touch with the human impact of policy decisions. "Mama, I think I know what Elena would want me to do, Sarah said, holding the job offer and wearing her grandmother's pearls. She would want me to be brave enough to accept this opportunity, even though it means leaving work I love and people I care about. Patricia smiled and embraced her daughter. Elena would be proud that you're making this decision based on how you can best serve others, not on what's easiest or most comfortable. That's exactly the kind of reasoning she would use. As Sarah drove back to her apartment that evening, she felt Elena's presence more strongly than she had since her grandmother's death. The letters, journal entries, and conversations with her mother had revealed a legacy far more extensive and influential than Sarah had ever imagined. Elena's simple gestures of compassion had created ripple effects that were still expanding, connecting a young soldier in Korea to a career opportunity that could help thousands of contemporary veterans. Sarah realized that accepting General Hayes' offer wasn't about abandoning her current work, but about expanding it. Elena's example showed that effective service required being open to opportunities that could multiply the impact of individual kindness. The position with the task force would allow Sarah to honor her grandmother's memory by applying Elena's philosophy of dignity and compassion at a scale that could transform how America cares for its veterans. That night, as Sarah prepared to call General Hayes with her decision, she touched Elena's pearls one final time and felt the weight of a legacy that had been building for over 70 years. Her simple gesture of honest advocacy in a routine meeting had revealed a connection that transcended coincidence, creating an opportunity to continue her grandmother's work in ways Elena never could have imagined, but certainly would have endorsed. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often follows important decisions. Sarah had spent Sunday evening drafting her resignation letter to Margaret and her acceptance call to General Hayes. The conversation with the general had been remarkably warm, with him expressing both professional satisfaction and personal gratitude that Elena's granddaughter would be joining the task force. Sarah, I want you to know that this feels like completing a circle that began 70 years ago in a Korean field hospital, General Hayes had said during their phone conversation. Elena planted seeds of compassion that are still growing. Your decision to join our team means those seeds will help transform how America cares for its veterans. As Sarah prepared for what would be her final weeks at the VA regional office, she felt a mixture of excitement and melancholy. The work she was leaving had become deeply meaningful, and the relationships she had built with veterans like David Thompson and Carlos Martinez represented exactly the kind of individual connections Elena had valued most. When Sarah arrived at the office, she found Margaret already at her desk, reviewing the policy report Sarah had completed over the weekend. Margaret's expression suggested she had guessed that significant changes were coming, even before Sarah could explain her decision. Sarah, this report is extraordinary, Margaret said, looking up from the comprehensive document. The recommendations are practical, well-researched, and clearly written. But, more than that, they demonstrate the kind of systemic thinking that could actually transform how we serve veterans. I have a feeling this isn't the last time I'll be seeing your name on important policy documents. Sarah explained her decision to accept the task force position, emphasizing her gratitude for Margaret's mentorship and the foundation she had built in their department. Margaret listened with the understanding expression of someone who had always known Sarah's talents would lead to greater opportunities. I'm not surprised by this opportunity, Sarah, though I'll miss your contributions here, Margaret said warmly. You have a rare combination of analytical ability and genuine compassion. More importantly, you understand that good policy must be rooted in respect for the people it serves. That perspective will serve you well in Washington. Throughout the morning, word spread about Sarah's new position, generating congratulations from colleagues who had watched her work with increasing respect over the past 3 years. But the most meaningful responses came from the veterans whose cases she had handled, including several who stopped by to thank her personally for her advocacy. David Thompson, the Vietnam veteran whose misfiled documentation Sarah had helped locate, arrived with his wife to express their gratitude. Miss Martinez, we wanted to thank you before you left for Washington. You gave us hope when we were ready to give up. More than that, you treated David with dignity when he felt like the system had forgotten about him. David's wife added, you reminded us that there are still people in government who see veterans as human beings, not just case numbers. We know you'll do good things in your new position, but we wanted you to know how much your individual care meant to us. Similar conversations continued throughout the week, as Sarah completed her transition responsibilities and prepared comprehensive handover documents for the cases she would be leaving behind. Each interaction reinforced her understanding that Elena's approach to individual compassion would remain essential even as she moved into policy development work. Carlos Martinez, the Marine whose claim had been expedited after Sarah's presentation to General Hayes, called to congratulate her on the promotion. "Miss Martinez, I heard about your new job through the Veteran Network. I wanted you to know that what you did for me changed everything. Not just getting my benefits approved, but the way you listened and made me feel like my service mattered." Carlos continued, "I've been telling other veterans about my experience, and several of them have contacted your office for help with their own cases. You started something bigger than just solving individual problems. You gave people hope that the system could actually work for them." These conversations helped Sarah understand that her transition from individual casework to systematic policy development wasn't abandoning Elena's approach, but scaling it up. The veterans she had helped were becoming advocates themselves, spreading the message that government service could be both competent and compassionate. On Wednesday, Sarah received an unexpected visit from General Hayes, who wanted to discuss her transition timeline and provide additional context about the task force's mission. They met in the same conference room where their connection had first been discovered, creating a sense of narrative completion that both found meaningful. "Sarah, I want to share some details about our work that will help you understand the scope of what we're attempting," General Hayes began. "The task force has been authorized to implement pilot programs in 12 regions nationwide, testing new approaches to veteran services integration. Your recommendations from the policy report will be central to these pilots." He explained that Sarah's continuous advocacy model was being adapted for implementation across different types of VA facilities, with veterans being assigned dedicated advocates who would follow their cases from initial contact through final resolution. "We're essentially taking Elena's approach of treating each person as an individual and building it into the system structure." General Hayes also revealed that Sarah's position would involve significant travel to the pilot sites, working directly with VA staff and veterans to ensure that policy changes were actually improving real-world outcomes. "You won't be sitting in Washington making theoretical recommendations. You'll be Elena's granddaughter taking her philosophy of compassionate service directly to the people who need it most." The conversation helped Sarah understand that her new role would allow her to maintain the individual focus that had always motivated her while creating systematic changes that could help thousands of veterans. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Elena would have encouraged her to pursue. On Friday, Sarah's last day at the regional office, Margaret organized a small farewell gathering in the conference room. Colleagues shared stories about Sarah's impact on their work and the veterans they served. Several mentioned how her approach to complex cases had influenced their own methods, creating a ripple effect of improved service throughout the department. "Sarah has taught all of us that good policy starts with seeing each case as a human being with a unique story," Margaret said during the informal ceremony. "She's shown us that efficiency and compassion aren't competing values, but complementary approaches that make our work both more effective and more meaningful." As the gathering concluded, Margaret presented Sarah with a framed photograph of Elena in her volunteer nurse uniform, which Margaret had found in the VA Historical Archives. "I thought you should have this for your new office. It shows your grandmother receiving a commendation for her volunteer service in 1985. She influenced veteran care for decades, just like you're going to do." Sarah was deeply moved by the gesture, particularly because it revealed yet another aspect of Elena's service she hadn't known about. The photograph showed Elena at age 60, still actively volunteering and receiving recognition for her advocacy work. It provided a powerful visual reminder that effective service could span decades and evolve with changing circumstances. That weekend, Sarah spent time organizing her apartment and preparing for her move to Washington. As she packed Elena's letters and journal, she reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led from her grandmother's simple gesture of kindness in a Korean hospital to this opportunity to influence veteran policy nationwide. The pearl necklace, which had started this journey by catching General Hayes' attention in a routine meeting, now felt like a talisman connecting past and future service. Sarah realized that Elena's influence had been building toward this moment for over 70 years, creating a legacy that transcended any individual career or achievement. On Sunday evening, Sarah received a call from her mother, who had been following her transition with pride and emotional support. "Mija, I've been thinking about what your grandmother would say about this opportunity. I think she would tell you that this is exactly why she kept Robert Hayes' letters all those years. She believed that acts of kindness create connections that last forever." Patricia continued, Elena used to say that we never know how our simple gestures might change someone's life, but we have to trust that goodness multiplies when we're brave enough to share it. Your new job is proof that she was right. One act of compassion in 1952 is still creating opportunities to help people in 2026. The conversation reinforced Sarah's understanding that accepting the task force position was about honoring a legacy that extended far beyond her own ambitions or career goals. Elena's example had shown that effective service required being open to opportunities that could multiply the impact of individual kindness across time and circumstance. Monday morning brought Sarah's first day as a member of General Hayes' task force, working from temporary offices in a building near the Pentagon. The team consisted of 12 people from various backgrounds: former military officers, VA administrators, policy analysts, and advocates who brought different perspectives to the complex challenge of improving veteran services. During the morning orientation, General Hayes introduced Sarah to the team by explaining both her professional qualifications and the personal connection that had brought them together. Sarah Martinez brings exceptional analytical skills and direct experience with veteran services, but more importantly, she understands that our work is fundamentally about honoring the dignity and sacrifice of every person who has served our country. The team's first project involved designing implementation protocols for the continuous advocacy model across the 12 pilot sites. Sarah found herself working with people who shared Elena's philosophy that effective service required both systematic thinking and individual compassion. It was exactly the kind of collaborative environment where her grandmother's values could create the greatest impact. As Sarah settled into her new role, she kept Elena's photograph on her desk and wore the pearl necklace daily. Colleagues often asked about the vintage jewelry, providing opportunities for Sarah to share Elena's story and the philosophy of service that guided their work. Elena's influence was becoming part of the task force's culture, spreading to people who had never met her but were inspired by her example. 3 months later, early reports from the pilot sites showed dramatic improvements in veteran satisfaction and case resolution times. The continuous advocacy model was working exactly as Sarah had predicted, with dedicated advocates cutting through bureaucratic obstacles and ensuring that each veteran received personalized attention throughout their interaction with the system. General Hayes called Sarah into his office to review the preliminary results and discuss expansion plans. Sarah, Elena would be amazed to see how her simple act of kindness to a wounded soldier has grown into systematic change that's helping thousands of veterans. Your grandmother's legacy is literally transforming how America cares for the people who served our country. As Sarah reviewed the success statistics from the pilot programs, she thought about Elena's belief that small gestures could create significant change over time. A Korean nurse's compassion for a wounded soldier had somehow led to policy improvements that would benefit generations of veterans. It was exactly the kind of meaningful impact Elena had always believed was possible when people had the courage to act with kindness and integrity. The story that had begun with a simple gesture in a Korean field hospital was continuing through Sarah's work with the task force. But she understood that it wouldn't end there. Elena's example had shown that effective service created ripple effects that extended far beyond any individual career or achievement. Sarah was simply the current guardian of a legacy that would continue growing long after she was gone, touching lives and creating opportunities for compassion that Elena never could have imagined but certainly would have celebrated. In quiet moments at her desk, surrounded by policy documents and implementation plans, Sarah often touched her grandmother's pearls and felt the weight of a legacy that had been building for over 70 years. The simple gesture of passing a pen in a meeting had revealed a connection that transcended coincidence, creating an opportunity to honor Elena's memory through service to thousands of veterans who would never know the Korean nurse whose kindness had made their better treatment possible.